how does traffic engineering kind of differ from other fields within civil engineering? Because there are so many, and I think it's an important distinction for engineers to understand. Maybe you could talk about it a bit.
Sure. So I think the people element is the differentiating factor for traffic engineering. People are part of the system that we're dealing with. And it's like hydraulics, where we're dealing with things like flow. But because people have different perspectives, perceptions, and ways to interpret the messages that they're getting, they react in unpredictable ways. And so people, when they travel.
Traffic engineering is one discipline within civil engineering. However, there is one thing that's extremely important that traffic engineers need to deal with that the other disciplines of civil engineering don't. And I bet you're not going to guess what it is. But in today's episode, our guest is going to share that. I have with me today Andrew Lee. Andrew is a licensed traffic engineer, in addition to being a licensed professional engineer, and he's also a senior consultant at Parametrix. So we're going to dive into this episode, and he's going to tell us all about traffic engineering and about that one variable that you really need to be aware of. I'm your host, Anthony Fasano, and this is the Civil Engineering Podcast. Parametrix helps their clients imagine what's possible. Whether it's resilient infrastructure, livable communities, or habitat restoration, they partner with clients to create vibrant, sustainable communities and restore the health of the planet for generations to come. As a 100% employee-owned company, their people have a vested interest in strong performance and exceptional client service. Interested in becoming an employee owner at Parametrix? Learn more at www.parametrix.com. Let's create tomorrow together. All right, now I'd like to welcome my guest onto the show for today. Andrew Lee is a licensed professional engineer, also a licensed traffic engineer, and a senior consultant at Parametrix. Andrew, welcome to the Civil Engineering Podcast.
Thank you, Anthony.
So, Andrew, maybe you can start by just telling our audience a little bit about yourself and what led you to specialize in traffic engineering.
Sure. So I've been in the industry for about 17 years. I started off in civil engineering, specializing in transportation. My dad was a civil engineer, and I went to college without a solid idea of what I wanted to do. But I took a transportation course from a professor from Europe who was really into alternative modes of transportation. I really enjoyed that class and decided to run with it after that.
Interesting. And, it's interesting how obviously, of course, our family background can impact us, but also our teachers, right, can really impact in kind of the direction you go as civil engineers, because it is such a broad industry and there are quite a few different directions that you can go. And so how does traffic engineering kind of differ from other fields within civil engineering? Because there are so many, and, I think it's an important distinction for engineers to understand. Maybe you could talk about it a bit.
Sure. So I think the people element is the differentiating factor for traffic engineering. People are part of the system that we're dealing with. And it's like hydraulics, where we're dealing with things like flow. But because people have different perspectives, perceptions, and ways to interpret the messages that they're getting, they react in unpredictable ways. And so people, when they travel, are also in different size vehicles. They have different speeds and reaction times. So the system's not really uniform. There's a lot of elements of chaos. And what we try to do in transportation is manage people's interpretation and reaction to get the behaviors that we want amidst all that chaos.
Yeah, it's interesting because you are really dealing with kind of the human element when you talk about traffic, right? Decision-making, timing, the variables like you suggest, different size cars, different size vehicles. And I think sometimes when you are a civil engineer and maybe you're not in traffic, you've only been exposed to traffic on your PE exam, right? It's a couple of questions, a couple of tables and things of that nature. So it's definitely interesting to kind of dive in a little bit deeper here and understand a little bit more about it. So in traffic engineering, Andrew, you deal with systems designed for interaction between people and infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and how it impacts your approach to to the design, essentially, this relationship?
Yeah, so the design elements I typically deal with can be things like alignments of the road, the width of the lanes, the curvature, the super elevation, but also elements like how the stripes are presented, whether there's color, the thickness of the stripe, the placement of the signs, traffic signals, and the types of information that we're trying to present there. And so the entire design is oriented around how people receive information, how they interpret, and then act on the information. So for me to design, it needs to be clearly presented. It needs to eliminate ambiguity. And sometimes we try to limit potential outcomes or try to mitigate catastrophic outcomes. And one example of that is going from a standard four-way intersection into a roundabout where because you're eliminating certain movements like left turns, we reduce the number of conflict points. And so it's that reduction in safety risk that we're always striving for, while also managing people's expectations.
Yeah, which is all very interesting to me because, the width of a traffic stripe could matter, right? In terms of like saving someone's life. So it's all really, I think it goes back to what you said earlier, that people component is such a differentiator because one decision from the design engineer could have a massive impact as to the safety of people and accidents and so on and so forth, which makes it such an impactful kind of discipline to work in. So with that being said, traffic engineering does cover a wide range of areas like walking, bicycling, accessible design, public transit, automobiles, right? You have pedestrians involved, road crossings. How do you kind of balance all of these different elements when you're working on a project?
Yeah, so I'm finding that in a lot of communities, especially more recently developed communities, our infrastructure is highly preferential to one mode, which is driving. But there are a lot of people who are not able to drive or choose not to drive for a variety of reasons. And so there's a need to provide at least a minimum level of access for the people that don't drive, and then also provide a system that's safe and comfortable so that not driving is a feasible choice for them on a regular basis. It's not going to be functional if it's just too uncomfortable for someone to use the system. And so that goes to a transportation principle of trying to protect our most vulnerable users through standards for things like accessibility, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then policies like Vision Zero, which strive to reduce the number of collisions and deaths related to traffic collisions down to zero.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In fact, we recently had an episode with someone who works in transportation safety from WSP USA talking basically a whole episode about Vision Zero, which is interesting. And it's interesting to see that, it's kind of a big vision, but it's interesting to see that there are communities that are actually seeing, zero fatalities. And there's been some, good feedback and results on that. So it's interesting to hear kind of your side of that from the traffic design standpoint. So when you think about designing for interaction, where people have to kind of recognize, interpret, and act, I would imagine that presents some pretty unique challenges, especially compared with other aspects of civil engineering. Again, it goes back to people. So talk a little bit about how you approach that, knowing that there is that interaction from people that you're kind of designing around, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, transportation is unique because as engineers and planners and then policymakers, because it goes down to politics a lot of times too, we're trying to account for people's behaviors. And it's very complex because sometimes people act irrationally. And that's a big element you can't always control. So we have hard standards that abide by kinematic principles like stopping sight distance, passing sight distance, setting a designated design speed for a road and making sure that the associated design details correspond with that, like curvature and whatnot. But then there's also soft standards, such as when travel demand exceeds capacity and we get elements like traffic jams. And so how we choose to design for such peak demands isn't necessarily an engineering decision. Sometimes it's a political decision. It's reflection on what the priorities of the community may be. A good example of that is like for most parking at shopping centers, it's designed to meet peak parking demand for like holiday times, Christmas times, but
Right.
most of the other time, most of that traffic, most of that parking lot is empty, and so it's not a hard and fast decision as to like what you design and plan for necessarily.
That's interesting. Yeah, and the more I think about it, based on what you said earlier in terms of like people being so critical in traffic, like if you're designing a building or you're designing a bridge, you're really designing against the forces of nature, right? Like wind, hurricane, earthquake. Whereas, like you said, you're dealing with a very irrational variable because everybody's different. So there's really no, computer simulation that you could put through for, I mean, I'm sure they use some, but you can't really capture all the variables because everyone's totally different ages, different experience levels, like you said, sizes of cars, all kinds of variables, which really, makes this very interesting. And, you know, people may say that many aspects of civil engineering are invisible. You don't see them, you don't think about them until there's a failure. While traffic engineering is very much about visibility and interaction. So how does that change your approach to project management as a being in traffic?
Yeah. So for traffic projects, a lot of times the interesting ones, at least, they're not linear. People are coming with different proposals. People are coming with different perspectives. And so having a really tight scope and accounting for those different perspectives is really important. I try to bring to people's attention whenever there's a request to study something else that this element might be out of scope. And so I always want to make sure that I'm disclosing to the client project progress and making sure that there are sacrifices and trade-offs that need to be made, and they are sometimes threats to the time, the schedule, and the budget.
Interesting. Yeah, it brings just a different variable kind of to the table. So when you're working in traffic engineering, how important is it, Andrew, to listen to clients, agencies, and the public? I would imagine obviously critical, but how does it influence your design and how does that interaction look on your projects?
We do a lot of public outreach meetings, which is a little bit out there for somebody who might be coming from an engineering background, but it's so much of a people profession. And so a lot of times when we start off, we just listen to the client and get an understanding of what's important to their priorities, and then understanding who they're representing, because staff may also be trying to account for the political stakeholders that they have to answer to, the business stakeholders on the street that we may be working on. There's also a big process of educating our clients and stakeholders on new standards, new technologies, because the state of the practice is always evolving. And so, I'm working on projects right now where the client has a very set perspective on where they'd like to go forward with, but we're bringing some new ideas in, and they've been receptive so far. And so it's still evolving, and we're still seeing where the project design is going to wind up.
And I would imagine, just kind of as a follow-up to this, that because of the level of interaction that you have with the public in the traffic world, your communication skills, your presentation skills would be pretty important as a traffic engineer. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I try to preface whenever I speak about technical issues like this is something a traffic engineer would know, because I try to bring it down to like everybody's an expert when it comes to traffic and transportation. Everybody travels in one way or another. And so I don't like to use elements of jargon and expertise because that's sort of alienating to people. So getting down to everybody else's level and understanding where they're coming from by just having a listening perspective and a listening first perspective is really helpful in establishing trust. But then also just when conversing, using plain language, avoiding jargon, and humanizing the different perspectives that we may have in order to reach common ground is really important. And that helps build a degree of comfort and therefore greater trust in our expertise as engineers.
Yeah, and I think that's why developing your soft skills, your communication skills is so important for civil engineers. I mean, I worked in land development, not traffic, but I still did a bunch of public meetings, had to present in front of boards. And I think, to Andrew's point, you do have to be careful because you do want people to know you're an expert to some degree, but you also want to talk over their heads so that they can understand you, or they feel like, this person's kind of showing off and I can't really communicate with them because they're not on my level. So you do need to kind of get down to a point where you can have a good conversation with them, maybe even collaborate with them on certain projects, depending on what the situation is. And it's just so important. I see a lot of kind of graduating civil engineers today, or civil engineers in school, just thinking about the technical side of what we do and saying, I don't really need to speak. I'm an engineer. I don't need to go out in public and do things, but you probably do. And especially in a lot of walks of civil engineering, you will need to do that. So I think it's actually a great differentiator for you as a civil engineer. If you can communicate effectively, you can be better at project management. You can be better at presenting. And it could be presenting to 2 people or 50 people, right? It's just either way, you kind of have to get your ideas together and be able to present them. And like Andrew said, you may have to present them to someone who's not going to have the same technical knowledge that you do, but it's critical that they get the picture. So you kind of have to figure out a way to explain it to them, which I think is just so important. So coming back to project management, Andrew, you mentioned that flexibility in project management is very important when it comes to traffic projects. Can you talk a little bit more about, how you maintain that flexibility as a project manager? As a project manager, your focus is the schedule and the budget of a project. Those are the 2 biggest things, of course, outside of safety of the public, which is critical in every walk of civil engineering. But talk about how you try to be flexible as a project manager, balancing all these things, but also remembering that you have a fixed schedule and a fixed budget.
Yeah, it starts with when we're scoping out the project. One way to do it is that we're proactive and we anticipate what might be coming down the pipe based on prior experience. And so programming it into the scope, schedule, and budget is certainly very helpful. And then sometimes there are things that we can't really control. Something comes out of left field. And that's where documentation comes in to make sure that if there is something out of scope, we bring it to the attention of the client, make sure that it's documented in at least an email, and then making sure that even if we don't request an outright adjustment in the budget, that there are some adjustments down the road that'll be necessary, and making sure that it's in the record so that we have justification for further task order changes or subtractions in scope as needed.
Yeah, that's really important from a project management standpoint. Of course, documentation, I think all the time is really important. But I think the one thing that Andrew said as well is really anticipating kind of risks at the beginning of your projects, right? We live in a world where in civil engineering, there are tons of inherent risks on our projects. I mean, there's so many things. You could probably make a huge list at the beginning of your project. Obviously, you can't plan and account for every risk because the price of your proposal would be insane. You'd have to make some assumptions and exclusions, of course. But I think from a project manager standpoint, you at least need to consider them. I know a lot of people will create what's called a risk register, maybe put a table together with a bunch of different risks and then try to score those risks as, high threat, high impact, or maybe low threat, low impact. Something that we teach in our project management training. But I do find that a lot of project managers don't do that. They got their RFP, they got their project, they know what they have to do, cost and schedule, they're focused on that, and they want to get to their deliverables and they just want to start going. But I will just kind of warn you that one risk can kind of blow up your project, if you will, and really get you off track. So anything you could do as a PM to consider all the risks, brainstorm with other stakeholders, talk to other people in your organization that have worked on projects like this before, or worked with this municipality before, or worked with this board before. I remember as a land development civil engineer, when I was going to a planning board, I would talk to someone else that maybe dealt with that planning board, because some planning boards are a little tougher than others, right? They have more comments, they have more things they're concerned about. So anything that you can find out about your project is going to help you. And I think, to Andrew's point, building in, whether it's time for that, flexibility for that in your scope and your schedule. And as long as you have a really good scope and you have really good documentation, then if something does come up outside of that scope or something is slowing your schedule down, you can try to address it and make sure, number one, you address it to keep your schedule on track. But if it's going to cost you more time or money, you're going to need to hopefully be able to recoup that from your client. So there's a lot there. We could probably do a whole episode on that, but definitely just wanted to highlight a couple of those points here. So Andrew, just to kind of wrap up this segment here, and we're still going to hit you with some career questions, but What final piece of advice that you can share with civil engineers that are interested in specializing in traffic engineering, and how can they kind of develop some of the skills that they're going to need for this field?
I think having a natural curiosity of the world around us and the systems around us and how people use the systems is critical. Whenever I travel, I'm always taking pictures, trying to use as many different modes of travel as possible and trying to take in what I like, what I don't like. So it's not always good examples. Sometimes there are some examples I don't want to emulate. And lastly, I think being sympathetic to the needs of people different than who we may be as individuals and seeing the needs of vulnerable users, seeing other people walking around, biking around, going at different speeds or having different reaction times helps us be more sympathetic to developing more universal designs that satisfy the needs and wants of everybody using the system.
Yeah, and that's a really cool thing. I mean, I know for me, one of the reasons I became a civil engineer was because I wanted to kind of look outside and be able to see the projects I'm working on. I think in traffic engineering, you're kind of surrounded by it every day, right? If you commute to work every day, you get home, you go out with your families, you take a walk. I mean, everything you see is kind of somehow really related to traffic engineering, roadways, et cetera. So I think that's a really cool aspect of it. So certainly an exciting aspect of civil engineering, and there's a lot going on in the traffic space. So we're happy to hear some thoughts on it from Andrew. What we're going to do now is take a quick break, and then we're going to come back with Andrew, and we're going to just pepper him with a couple of last career-related questions on our civil engineering career hot seat. So we'll be right back. All right, I'm back with our guest for today, Andrew Lee, Senior Consultant at Parametrix. We've talked a lot about traffic engineering, but now, Andrew, it's time for you to go on to our civil engineering career hot seat for a couple of career questions. You ready?
Yeah.
All right, so Andrew, do you have any specific rituals that you practice every day? For example, a morning routine or a lunchtime routine, or just something that you do consistently on a daily basis that has contributed to your success?
Yeah, I think outside of work, I'm really lucky to live within biking distance to my office. So I commute by bike and it's about 20 minutes. It's a great way to get my energy out and decompress, just provide a little bit of a buffer between home and work. I try to take my lunch outside to recalibrate my circadian rhythms. And then within the workspace, I try to write out a priority list at the very beginning of the day to see, what sort of major things I need to get to and try to follow that as much as possible without getting derailed from normal needs that arise during the day.
That's great. And I think that's awesome that you get the opportunity to bike to work. That sounds like it would be really, really great physically. So that's awesome. Andrew, has there been a book or an author or a training session or leadership philosophy or just something that you've encountered through your career that has kind of stuck with you and has really helped you in your professional or personal development?
Well, it's a little bit more on the technical side, but it has helped my professional perspective. There's a book by Donald Shoup called The High Cost of Free Parking. And he was a very innovative thinker. He talks about translating transportation outcomes into tangible benefits for the people that are affected, because a lot of times transportation, it has a dispersed benefit. A lot of people can benefit from a certain facility, but it's concentrated impact. Like if you live next to the road that's affected, you're affected by that much more. And so he came up with this really great breakthrough to find a way to pay people back for that negative impact. His big breakthrough is that if you charge people for parking, you could put the money back into the community through a neighborhood benefits district. And so that's really stuck with me, is that principle of trying to find a way to compensate people that may be negatively impacted and finding a win in order to gain consensus.
That's interesting. That's really cool. So, Andrew, thinking back on your managers of the past, and we're not asking you to name specific names, but if you think about your favorite or your favorite managers, what was it that made them your favorite? We're trying to understand some of the characteristics of really good leaders in civil engineering.
Yeah, in my first job out of college, I had a manager, Marty, who just spent time with me to hang out. Surprisingly, he invited me to go on hikes, and we spent a lot of time on long road trips driving to jobs. So we just got to know each other on an interpersonal basis outside of work. And that's really stuck with me. Feel really lucky that, getting to know the people that I work with in a non-work space, just it sticks with me in trying to, foster mentoring other people. And then one of my more recent managers, David, he gave me the space to figure things out. I came into a position more as a planner and was transitioning into an engineer. And I just had a lot of freedom to figure things out on my own. He's not much of a micromanager. And so I'd get a problem, get some time and just sort of work things out on my own. And it's a real luxury to have that ability to just figure things out.
That's awesome. No, I think that's great first of all, I think getting to know the people you work with on a personal level can be really beneficial when it comes to, listen, we work with people every day. We spend a lot of time with them, and it's good to really get to know them so you can connect with them just outside of, hey, what do you do as a civil engineer, let's say. And I think that second part about giving people some space is really great too, right? People are creative. Even engineers, we are creative too. If you give them a little space, they can kind of leverage some of that creativity. It sounds like in the traffic world, that's important as well with some of the different things going on as well. All right, last question we have for you, Andrew. We call it the civil engineering career elevator advice question. So if you were to get into an elevator with an up-and-coming civil engineer, you had about 30 to 40 seconds with him or her, what career advice would you share with him or her based on your career to date?
I'd say that my career success so far has depended very strongly on my communication skills and being able to talk to people of all walks of life in a straightforward, simple manner. So I would highly encourage new civil engineers to work on their public speaking skills. Also, when in a meeting, try to ask at least one question in every meeting, even if you're not one of the main players. But interjecting with a well-worded question just shows that you're paying attention and that you have something to add. And lastly, don't be afraid to reach out for help. It's everybody. We as engineers try to mentor and foster professional development. And so even if we're not in a space where we have a lot of time, I always try to offer my expertise, and I find it very complimentary when people reach out for help. So, yeah.
That's great. No, I would agree with that. I think engineers are always looking to give back and help people out, even though we do come off as pretty busy, but I do agree with that. And I really like, what you said there about being plugged in these meetings and being able to ask questions. I think that really can help you. And just one thing that I'll share as far as the public speaking goes, for those of you out there that have heard Andrew talk about public speaking, we talked about it a few times in this episode. There's a great organization called Toastmasters International that you may have heard of. It's very inexpensive. It's a nonprofit. You can join it, and it really helps you to develop your speaking skills in a very safe kind of community of other people that are trying to develop them as well. And for me, it was a real game changer in developing my speaking skills. And I would recommend looking into that if you're trying to say, well, I want to get better at speaking, but I don't know how. Yes, you could read a book, but you can also do something that's more interactive like Toastmasters that can be a really great help. So, Andrew, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy day and spending it with us here on the Civil Engineering Podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Andrew. Really interesting stuff. Just the amount of variability that traffic engineers have to deal with, having to think about people and their reactions and their decisions is got to be a really, really big challenge, but also a very interesting thing to have to deal with on a daily basis. So I'm happy that he shared some thoughts on it. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to our channel here. We put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help civil engineers become better managers and leaders. I'll see you next week.